right, moving on here. Pastor Steve, I have a question that very simple, but it says, is pornography adultery and grounds for divorce?
When you're looking at what Jesus said about grounds for divorce, I'll read you the passage. It's in Matthew chapter 19.
Thanks, Anna, for posting that date. I just saw that on there for Men's Signet.
And what Jesus says is, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. And when you're talking about sexual immorality in that passage, it is the word porneia in Greek, but it's the act itself. It's the whole idea of you're breaking your marriage vows in the passage. It's not lust. So when Jesus does deal with lust in Matthew chapter 5, where he says, if you look on a woman to lust after her, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. Well, I've had some people who've said, looking at pornography is adultery. It's a divorceable offense, and that kind of thing. And it is a bad thing. But if you start taking and using that as the standard, then if I'm angry with you without a cause, Jesus said that's the same as murder. And so now shall I be put to death for murder if I'm angry at somebody without a cause. And you go down the list of sins. Covetousness is greed, and covetousness is what causes stealing. And so should I go to jail for 3 years because I coveted an item and in my heart I've stolen it? You see what I mean? And so you get into this situation where you're not actually dealing with the passage in the way that God would have you do it. The reason that God allows divorce for adultery is because adulterers were put to death in the Old Testament. And so when they weren't doing it at the time that Jesus was teaching this stuff, and so that's why God allows divorce. If you were keeping the Old Testament law in this situation, if you commit adultery and your wife comes in and talks to me and says, Matt did this, what should I do? Well, I go, well, hun, don't worry about it. We'll go take care of Matt. And then we take you out, stone you, and you're dead. And there's not a question of what she does.
Right.
What she does is she moves on with her life without a husband at that point because we've put him to death for adultery. And so when you're thinking about what the word porneia means in Matthew chapter 19, you have to keep it in that kind of context. That's what Jesus is talking about. And so porneia includes all kinds of sexual immorality, which includes adultery. It includes incest. It includes bestiality. It includes homosexuality. It's an overall term for any kind of sexual relationship that is illicit. And for all those things that I just mentioned, in the Old Testament, it was the death penalty. And so I don't think that most people would be coming up and going, okay, well, pornography should get the death penalty. Mm-hmm. What it needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be taken care of. And I don't think that it's something that any Christian woman, because usually that's who's putting up with it. I don't think it's anything that any Christian woman should be putting up with. And frankly, I think you should be having a big fat fight over that. And it should be turmoil in your household until it gets taken care of. And what's liable to happen is the guy's got to make a choice. And the guy's going to make a choice between following Jesus and doing what's right by his wife or leaving. And at that point, what you have is the unbeliever leaves because he doesn't want to be married to a Christian. Mm-hmm. You're a Christian, and that kind of stuff is not supposed to be going on in your marriage. And so that is the stand that I would be making. I wouldn't just call it adultery and walk out on the marriage. A lot of guys struggle with that kind of thing in their life, and it's frankly, that whole mindset can be a whole lot different for a woman than it is for a man. I'm not making excuses, but guys struggle with that, and what needs to happen is the guy needs to get his act together and quit and be satisfied with his wife and with his marriage. In the book of Proverbs, it talks about the marriage relationship and talks about the wife's body and says, let her satisfy you. And don't spread your, don't take your fountain out into the streets, basically. It's poetic language. But anyway, it's talking about being satisfied in the marriage relationship. That's how it's supposed to go. So I wouldn't call it adultery in the sense of that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 19. It is lust. And it is something that is a hard issue in Matthew chapter 5. So
I like that answer. I never heard you explain that way before with the stoning for adultery and that by divorce, but that makes total sense.
Yeah.
All right, are you good on that?
Yep.